What if you've been alive all this time but never truly existed? Imagine this. Every day, you wake, dress, answer messages, sit through meetings, meet deadlines. You function, you produce, you check off tasks. But in the quiet moments, when the screen dims, when the room is still, something feels missing. Not just tiredness, but a deep absence, like a part of you has been quietly slipping away while you were busy keeping up. We've been taught to measure our worth by our usefulness, to believe that if we are not doing, we are wasting time. But what if it's the other way around? What if it's in the spaces of doing nothing that our truest self finally speaks? Welcome. Today, we're going to pause and listen. We'll explore what it means to be more than a function, through the lens of Georges Bataille, who dared to call uselessness sacred, and Jung, who believed that the self we ignore becomes the shadow we fear. This is not about quitting your job or fleeing to the mountain. It's about remembering something quietly radical. You are not here to be useful. You are here to exist. So, take a breath. Let's begin. From the moment we are born, we are taught to move, to reach, to strive, to prove. Praise is given for performance, affection tied to achievement. Slowly, without knowing it, we begin to trade the quiet presence of being for the restless currency of doing. We learn to become useful before we learn to become ourselves. And somewhere along this path, our sense of identity starts to fuse with our function. We are students, workers, achievers, never simply humans, never simply here. Georges Bataille saw this clearly. He believed that modern society trains us to serve systems, to reduce life to cycles of production and consumption. For Bataille, this utilitarian view of existence was a kind of spiritual amnesia, a forgetting of our sacred, purposeless essence. In his view, true freedom lies not in what we produce, but in what we waste, what we sacrifice without gain. He called this the realm of the sacred, the part of life that cannot be justified by use. But that's hard to see in a world where rest feels like guilt and silence feels like failure. Jung approached this from another angle. He saw how people repress parts of themselves to fit into roles, what he called the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to adapt to society's expectations. It helps us function, yes, but often at the cost of our deeper self. Over time, we forget where the mask ends and the face begins. We convince ourselves that our schedule is our soul, and our worth lives in the to-do list. We stop asking what we love, and instead ask, what's next? Imagine a person who has done everything right, graduated top of their class, secured a high-paying job, followed the path laid out before them. From the outside, they're thriving, but inside, they feel like a ghost in their own life. Why? Because they've learned how to function, but not how to be. And being, unlike doing, cannot be measured or monetized. It has no metric. It just is. We have become like machines who believe they are human, forgetting that breath, wonder, and stillness are not errors in the code, but signs that something deeper is still alive. This is the tension we carry, the pressure to be efficient while yearning to be real. And that tension, over time, wears thin. But beneath the surface of our daily performance, another self waits, untouched by titles or tasks, a self that doesn't serve a function but simply longs to be. To reach that self, we must first see the cost of our conditioning. Like light filtered through frosted glass, our essence is there, blurred but present. As we move deeper, we'll descend into that blur. We'll explore how the human soul has been quietly extracted from its rituals, and how meaning was replaced with motion. Because to understand why we've stopped existing, we must understand what we've started serving. Usefulness. On the surface, it appears noble. To be helpful, productive, efficient. These seem like virtues. But what happens when usefulness becomes a demand, a requirement for our right to exist? Slowly, imperceptibly, it becomes a kind of tyranny, one that seeps into how we view others, and more tragically, how we view ourselves. We begin to evaluate our days not by whether we lived them, but by how much we got done. The value of a life becomes indistinguishable from the output it generates. Simone Weil, the French mystic and philosopher, once warned that the modern world is haunted by the obsession with utility. She saw how industrial society had reduced human beings to functions within a machine. The useful, she wrote, is only truly beautiful when it is no longer useful. In other words, the most human aspects of our lives, love, art, contemplation, grace, are not things we do to achieve something else. They are ends in themselves. But in a world ruled by usefulness, even these are monetized or measured. A hobby becomes a side hustle. A conversation becomes networking. Rest becomes recovery so we can work more. Nothing is allowed to simply be. This tyranny can be seen in something as small as how we respond to the question, "What do you do?" A seemingly innocent phrase, but one that often carries an invisible weight. It doesn't ask, "Who are you?" or "What moves you?" It demands a justification, as if your being must be redeemed by function. This isn't merely social convention, it's a worldview. A lens that treats people as tools, relationships as transactions, and time as a resource to be optimized rather than experienced. Nietzsche touched on this in a different key. He warned that modern man, in abandoning the sacred, turns to utility as a poor replacement. Without a higher vision of life, we fill the void with endless striving, a means without an end. We become, in his words, the last men, safe, efficient, and deeply asleep to what makes life worth living. To Nietzsche, this wasn't progress. It was a spiritual collapse, an exhaustion of the soul disguised as comfort. Imagine, for a moment, a person who has achieved everything our culture deems useful: financial success, status, productivity. Yet they lie awake at night with a strange hollowness inside. Not because they failed, but because they never asked why they were succeeding. They climbed a ladder only to find it was leaning against the wrong wall. That emptiness is the shadow of usefulness, the place where meaning should be, but isn't. And so, we begin to see the trap. When usefulness becomes the only measure, life loses its depth. We cease to see people as mysteries and begin to see them as roles, even ourselves. The soul flattens under the weight of perpetual performance. But not all is lost. In every system that seeks to extract value, there are small acts of refusal, moments of stillness, laughter, beauty that serve no purpose. These are not wastes of time. They are quiet revolts. And it's here, in this sacred uselessness, that we start to remember ourselves. Next, we'll follow this thread deeper. We'll ask, what happens when the rituals that once gave shape to our inner lives are stripped of their meaning, leaving only motion without memory? Because if we've lost the soul of our rituals, we may have also lost the mirror that once reflected who we were becoming. If these ideas have touched something within you, feel free to pause and reflect, or share your thoughts quietly in the comments. This space is here for gentle, shared exploration. There is a quiet kind of suffering that hides beneath our busyness. A guilt that arises not from wrongdoing, but from the simple act of not doing. You may have felt it, that creeping sense of unease when you choose to rest, the inner voice that accuses you of laziness for enjoying a moment of stillness. In a culture that prizes motion, stillness feels like a betrayal. We sit in silence, yet our minds race with self-reproach, haunted by to-do lists and the imagined disappointment of others. It's not simply that we're unwilling to rest. It's that we no longer know how to rest without shame. Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst and philosopher, saw this clearly in his work, The Sane Society. He argued that modern man has become alienated from his own being, reduced to a marketing character, someone who views themselves as a product to be improved, sold, and consumed. In such a paradigm, any pause is suspect. It threatens the image we've constructed, the identity built not on essence, but on performance. Even solitude becomes another item to schedule, another task to optimize. The result is a kind of psychic imprisonment, chains not made of iron, but of expectation. Carl Jung, too, recognized this dynamic. For him, the soul requires inwardness, a turning toward the unconscious, a descent into the depths where transformation occurs. But such inner work is slow, dreamlike, non-linear. It is not useful in the way society demands. Jung warned that without space for this reflective stillness, we risk losing contact with the self, that deep, mysterious core of who we are. When we constantly flee into activity, we become strangers to ourselves. And worse, we grow afraid of the silence, mistaking it for emptiness when it may actually be the voice of something sacred trying to speak. Consider the child who lays in the grass, and watches clouds move across the sky. There's no purpose in this act, no measurable gain. Yet there is a profound presence, a kind of knowing without thinking. But what happens when that child grows up in a world that teaches her every moment must be accounted for? She learns to associate idleness with failure, and over time, forgets how to simply be. That innocence is lost not through corruption, but through conditioning. Stillness then becomes a radical act. To stop, to be unproductive, is to challenge a deeper belief that we must earn our existence. But what if we didn't have to? What if we could begin again, not as workers, not as achievers, but as beings with intrinsic worth? This is not an easy path. It requires unlearning. It demands that we face the discomfort that rises in the quiet and ask, who am I without my doing? Yet this question does not lead us into despair. It leads us toward the sacred. And as we'll explore next, it is through recovering forgotten rituals, those ancient containers of meaning, that we begin to reconnect with what we've lost. Like lanterns in the dark, these rituals do not push us forward, but draw us inward, illuminating a way of being that does not require justification. What if the parts of you that feel most human, the longing, the imagination, the silence, are precisely the parts that produce nothing? What if everything beautiful about being alive begins not in usefulness, but in what the world might call waste? In a culture obsessed with outcomes, to waste time is to commit a small act of rebellion, but perhaps it is also a sacred return, a gesture toward a self that remembers how to be without needing to prove. Simone Weil once wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." Yet in our economy of utility, attention has been fragmented, divided, sold. We attend not to what calls our soul, but to what performs, what trends, what can be monetized. We forget how to attend with no purpose beyond the act itself, to listen to the wind, to follow a thought nowhere, to write a poem no one will read. These are not failures. They are remnants of a deeper self, one that has not yet surrendered to the machinery of modern time. The forgotten self lives not on the clock, but in those timeless moments when we lose ourselves and paradoxically begin to remember who we are. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han speaks of this forgetting in the burnout society. He notes how we have shifted from a disciplinary society ruled by commands to an achievement society driven by self-optimization. Under this regime, even leisure is harnessed for productivity, rest becomes recovery, creativity becomes content, and existence itself becomes performance. We have forgotten the art of waste, not as destruction, but as mystery, as that which is sacred because it resists being measured. The forgotten self does not ask to be used. It asks to be witnessed, and perhaps, if we are quiet enough, to be loved. In traditional societies, rituals existed not to produce, but to connect, to mark time, to hold grief, to celebrate the mystery of being. Today, these rituals have largely vanished, replaced by efficiency. But without them, we drift. We become like roots torn from the soil, functional perhaps, but no longer alive. To waste time in ritual, in art, in solitude, is to replant those roots. It is to say, I am not a machine. I do not need to earn my place here. I already belong. And yet, to return to this place of belonging, we must pass through discomfort. We must face the void that opens when the doing stops, when the noise fades, when we sit alone with ourselves and ask, what remains when I am no longer useful? This is not an easy question, but perhaps, just beyond that silence, something waits, something wild and ancient, something we once knew before we were taught to forget. Like a fire that burns without warming, it flickers at the edge of our vision, and in the next breath, we begin to see. To reclaim our lives, we must first reclaim our time, not by managing it better, but by questioning what it has become. For time, in the modern world, is no longer lived. It is used, tracked, monetized, broken into blocks and filled with tasks. But this is not the time our ancestors knew. It is not the time of the seasons, or the body, or the breath. It is a colonized time, owned by systems that seek only output, not meaning. The philosopher Ivan Illich, in his critique of industrial society, spoke of the war on subsistence, a quiet erosion of our ability to dwell in time rather than spend it. This war continues today, not with weapons, but with calendars, with deadlines, with notifications that slice the present into 1,000 fragments. To decolonize time, then, is not simply to resist overwork. It is to unlearn the belief that only measurable time matters. It is to remember slow time, sacred time, what some indigenous cultures call dream time, where past, present, and future spiral rather than march. In such time, we are not tasks on a to-do list. We are rhythms, pulses, unfolding stories. In her reflections on temporality and trauma, psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk reminds us that healing happens not in the clock, but in the body's sense of time. When we are truly present, deeply at rest or in flow, we step outside the linear and into the eternal. This is not a luxury, it is a necessity. For as long as our time belongs to something else, we remain divided from ourselves. But to sit by a window and watch the light shift across a floor, to take a walk without a destination, to listen to a piece of music all the way through without distraction, these are not idle acts, they are acts of return, each one a quiet rebellion. To decolonize time is to rejoin life not as a worker or consumer, but as a witness. It is to slow down enough to hear the world breathing again, and to remember that we too are part of that breath. But this remembering is not always peaceful. At first, it may feel like standing at the edge of a vast sea, unsure how to swim without instruction. And yet, in that uncertainty lies a promise, a new rhythm, a forgotten music waiting just beneath the silence, ready to carry us back. We began with a quiet question: what if functioning isn't the same as existing? Along the way, we looked into the mirrors held up by thinkers like Erich Fromm and Ivan Illich, by artists and poets, and by the unnoticed parts of ourselves. We saw how the self was shaped and often confined by a culture that teaches us to be useful before we are allowed to simply be. We explored how guilt attaches itself to stillness, how the body rebels in silence, and how time, our most intimate inheritance, has been taken and sold back to us in pieces. And yet, beneath all that structure, something remains untouched, a deeper rhythm, a way of being that does not depend on performance or productivity. You are not a machine, you are not a task, you are not here to function. You are here to live, wide-eyed, slow-hearted and whole. Not every hour must be filled. Not every breath must be earned. Even the so-called wasted moments, those pauses, wanderings, daydreams, are not waste at all. They are where life quietly gathers its meaning. Perhaps this is what Simone Weil meant when she wrote that attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. To simply pay attention to the world, to oneself, without striving to change or prove anything, that is a sacred act. That is existence. So now, as this reflection draws to a close, take a breath. A deep one. Not to prepare for the next task, but just to feel that you are still here. You were never meant to function. You were meant to be. And that, in itself, is enough. Thank you for joining me in this quiet reflection. If you feel moved, I'd love to hear your own insights or questions in the comments below. Also consider joining our growing community by subscribing as we walk this path of meaning together.